3 weeks before Bob Gimlin died, he sent me a package containing something that will change everything we thought we knew about the Patterson-Gimlin film. Inside wasn't just the missing footage. It was proof that on October 20th, 1967, Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin encountered something far more terrifying than the creature we've all seen walking across that creek bed. Some people spend their entire careers chasing mysteries they'll never solve. I'm one of them. My name is David Martinez. I'm 58 years old, and for the past 30 years I've dedicated my life to studying a piece of film that runs exactly 59.85 seconds long. Before you dismiss me as another Bigfoot obsessive, you should know that I spent 15 years as a film restoration specialist for the Library of Congress. I've handled original reels from the Lumiere brothers. I've authenticated footage from the First World War. I know film stock, degradation patterns, splicing techniques, and chemical signatures the way a jeweler knows diamonds. When I tell you something about celluloid and emulsion, I'm not guessing. The letter arrived on September 14th, 2013. I remember the date because it was my daughter's birthday, and I was wrapping presents when my wife brought in the mail. The envelope was unremarkable, cream-colored, slightly worn at the edges, but the return address made my hands freeze. Bob Gimlin, Yakima, Washington. I'd published dozens of technical analyses of the Patterson-Gimlin film, presented at conferences, written articles for cryptozoology journals and mainstream film preservation magazines. But I'd never contacted Gimlin directly. In 3 decades of research, I'd respected his obvious desire for privacy. The man was a living legend who wanted nothing to do with legends. His handwriting was careful, almost architectural. Each letter precisely formed, the way men of his generation were taught in schoolhouse penmanship classes. The message was brief. Mr. Martinez, I've read your technical work on the film Roger and I shot in 1967. You understand things about film that most people don't. I think we should talk. There was more that day than what people have seen. If you're interested in the truth, come to my ranch. Below that, a phone number and an address. I called the next morning. A woman answered, Gimlin's daughter, and she seemed surprised but not unfriendly. Dad doesn't usually do this, she said. He must have his reasons. We arranged a visit for the following week. The drive from my home in Portland to Yakima took just under 4 hours. I drove through the Columbia River Gorge on a gray October morning, the same month Patterson and Gimlin had their encounter 46 years earlier. The landscape shifted from the lush greenery of western Oregon to the drier, more austere terrain of eastern Washington. Gimlin's ranch sat at the end of a long gravel road, surrounded by rolling hills covered in sage and bunch grass. The house was modest, single-story, with a wraparound porch that looked out over miles of empty country. Bob Gimlin met me at the door. He was 82 years old then, but he stood straight, shoulders back, with the bearing of a man who'd spent his life working with horses and cattle. His face was deeply lined, weathered by decades of sun and wind. His eyes were blue-gray, sharp, and evaluating. He wore a flannel shirt tucked into Wrangler jeans, boots that had seen serious use. His handshake was firm, calloused, the grip of someone who'd never had a soft day in his life. "Come on in," he said. "Coffee's on." We sat at his kitchen table, mugs of black coffee steaming between us. The house was quiet except for the ticking of a wall clock and the occasional creak of settling wood. Through the window I could see horses in a distant pasture, their breath visible in the cool morning air. "I'll be straight with you," Gimlin said, his voice rough but controlled. "I don't do interviews anymore. Haven't for years. People want me to say it was fake, or they want me to embellish, make it more exciting than it was, but your work, The technical stuff about the film itself, that's different. You're looking at what's actually there. I've tried to be objective, I said. The film is remarkable regardless of what it shows. The clarity, the consistency of the subject's movement, the way the light hits the fur. It's either the most sophisticated costume work of 1967, or it's genuine. Gimlin studied me for a long moment. Roger died in '72, he said finally. Cancer. Before he went, we talked about that day, about what we filmed, about what we didn't show people. My heart rate picked up, but I kept my expression neutral. What do you mean? He looked out the window, watching his horses. There was more that day, he repeated. More footage. More than what's been seen. Roger and we made some decisions about what to share and what to keep back. We had our reasons. Can you tell me about those reasons? Not yet, Gimlin said, turning back to me. I need to know you're not going to sensationalize this. I need to know you understand what's at stake. Roger carried this for 5 years before he died. I've carried it for 41. I'm not getting any younger, Mr. Martinez. At some point, someone needs to know the whole truth. I'm listening, I said. He stood up, walked to a bookshelf, and pulled down a photo album. He flipped through it until he found what he wanted, a black and white photograph of 2 men standing beside horses. One was clearly Gimlin, decades younger, lean and serious. The other was stockier, with a determined expression and eyes that seemed to look through the camera rather than at it. That's Roger, Gimlin said, best friend I ever had. He was obsessed with finding Bigfoot. Not for fame, not for money. He just needed to know if they were real. When we saw her that day at Bluff Creek, when we got that footage, he was vindicated. But he was also terrified of what? Gimlin closed the album. That's what you need to understand. And I'll tell you. But first, I need to know you'll keep coming back. I need to know this isn't just another story to you. It's not, I said. I've spent half my life on this. Then come back, he said. Come back in a few months. We'll talk more. I need time to decide how much to tell you. I drove back to Portland with more questions than answers, but with one certainty. Bob Gimlin was preparing to unburden himself of something he'd carried for nearly half a century. And whatever it was, it had terrified Roger Patterson enough that even while dying, he'd kept it secret. I returned to Bob Gimlin's ranch on a cold January morning in 2014, 3 months after our first meeting. Snow dusted the hills, and wood smoke rose from his chimney in a straight line against the still air. He was waiting on the porch, same flannel shirt, same weathered boots, but something in his posture had softened. He nodded as I approached, and I understood without words that I'd passed some invisible test simply by returning. Over the next 3 years, I made that drive from Portland to Yakima 16 times. Sometimes in spring when the hills turned green and wildflowers bloomed along the roadsides. Sometimes in August when the heat shimmered off the pavement and the grasslands baked golden brown. Each visit followed a similar rhythm. We'd sit on his porch or at his kitchen table, drinking coffee that grew cold while we talked. Gimlin would share a little more each time, testing my reactions, gauging whether I was listening to understand or listening to exploit. He told me about Roger Patterson with a depth of detail I'd never encountered in any documentary or book. Roger was a dreamer, Gimlin said during a visit in April 2014, leaning back in his porch chair while barn swallows darted overhead. He'd get an idea in his head and couldn't let it go. Bigfoot wasn't a hobby for him. It was a calling. He'd grown up hearing stories from his grandmother about wild men in the mountains. When he got older, he started investigating reports, talking to native folks who had their own names for these things. He wasn't trying to prove people wrong. He was trying to prove something existed. I learned that Patterson had been a rodeo rider, that he'd broken nearly every bone in his body at one point or another, that he'd written a self-published book about Bigfoot in 1966, a year before the famous footage. Gimlin's voice would soften when he talked about their friendship, how they'd spend weeks in the wilderness together, following up on reports that usually led nowhere. Most of the time we'd find nothing, Gimlin said, misidentified bears, hoaxed tracks, people wanting attention. But Roger never got discouraged. He'd say, "Bob, they're out there. We just haven't been in the right place at the right time yet." During a summer visit in 2015, Gimlin showed me maps, old topographical charts with pencil marks indicating their search areas, their camp locations, the path they'd taken on October 20th, 1967. His finger traced the route along Bluff Creek, a remote tributary in the Six Rivers National Forest of Northern California. We'd been following reports of track finds in the area for days, he said. Fresh prints. Too big to be bear, too clear to be fake. Something was moving through that drainage, and Roger was convinced we were close. The burden of being the sole surviving witness weighed on Gimlin in ways that became more apparent with each visit. By 2016, he was 85 years old, and age was catching up with the man who'd seemed so indestructible during our first meeting. His hands shook slightly when he poured coffee. He moved more carefully, favoring his left knee. But his mind remained sharp, and his memory of that October day was crystalline in its clarity. Roger died in January of '72, Gimlin told me during a visit in March 2016, his voice barely above a whisper. Hodgkin's lymphoma. He was only 38. Toward the end, when he knew he wasn't going to make it, we talked about the film, about what it meant, about what people would think. He made me promise something, David, made me swear on my life. What did he ask you to promise? Gimlin stood slowly, grimacing as his knee protested. Come with me. I want to show you something. He led me through his house to a back bedroom that served as an office. The walls were covered with framed photographs, rodeo ribbons, certificates from various organizations. In the corner stood a gun safe, heavy steel, combination lock. Gimlin worked the dial with practiced movements, and the door swung open with a solid clunk. Inside, beneath hunting rifles and a vintage revolver, sat a wooden case about the size of a shoebox. Gimlin lifted it out carefully, reverently, and placed it on his desk. His hands trembled as he opened the latch. "This is the camera," he said, "the Cine Kodak K100, Roger's camera, the one that filmed her." I stared at the 16mm camera nestled in foam padding. It was smaller than I'd expected, compact and solid, with a hand crank on the side and a leather carrying strap worn smooth from use. The metal body showed scratches and dings from hard use in rough country. This was the artifact at the center of cryptozoology's greatest mystery. The device that had captured 59.5 seconds of footage that had been analyzed, debated, and argued over for nearly 5 decades. Roger gave it to me before he died, Gimlin said, told me to keep it safe, told me never to let anyone use it to make money off what we saw. He wanted the truth protected, not exploited. I reached toward it, then stopped. "May I?" Gimlin nodded. I lifted the camera, surprised by its weight, maybe 3 pounds. The viewfinder was dusty but intact. The film gate showed the residue of old oil. This machine had been handheld on that autumn day in 1967, pointed at something that shouldn't exist, operated by a man whose hands were probably shaking with excitement and fear. "Do you know how film speed works?" Gimlin asked. I nodded. "The frame rate. How many frames per second the camera captures. It affects how motion appears when played back." Roger cranked this at about 16 frames per second, maybe 18, Gimlin said. People have argued about that for years, saying it affects how the creature appears to move. But what they don't know, what nobody's ever been told, is that Roger didn't film for 59 seconds and stop. He kept filming. He captured 3 minutes and 42 seconds total. My breath caught. The film was edited? Gimlin closed the wooden case, his jaw tight. Roger edited it. Cut out what came before and what came after the famous sequence. He made that choice, and I stood by him. We both knew that what we'd captured was real, but we also knew that showing everything would destroy any chance of being believed. Why? What else was on the film? Gimlin looked at me with eyes that held 49 years of secrets. You need to understand the context first. You need to know exactly what happened that day, minute by minute, so you can comprehend why we did what we did. And you need to understand what Roger saw in those final weeks before he died, why he made me promise to protect this footage until the right time. He placed the camera back in the safe and closed the door. The metallic click echoed in the small room. "Next time you come," Gimlin said, "I'll tell you everything. Every detail of October 20th, 1967. What the film shows and what it doesn't show. What we cut out and why it's been locked away for half a century." I left Yakima that evening knowing I stood at the threshold of something profound. Bob Gimlin had spent my entire adult life guarding a secret that had haunted 2 men, killed one of them while he kept it, and aged the other under its weight. And now, finally, he was ready to share the burden. I returned to Bob Gimlin's ranch on a gray morning in October 2017, exactly 50 years after the Patterson-Gimlin film was shot. The timing wasn't accidental. Gimlin had asked me to come on this specific date, said it felt right to finally tell the complete story on the anniversary. When I arrived, he was standing in his driveway, hands in his jacket pockets, staring toward the distant mountains as if he could see all the way to Bluff Creek from here. We sat at his kitchen table, and this time he pulled out a worn notebook, the kind with a black and white marble cover that schoolchildren used decades ago. Roger's handwriting filled the pages, notes, and sketches from their 1967 expedition. Gimlin handled it like sacred text, turning pages carefully, finding the entry for October 20th. "People think we just stumbled onto her by accident," Gimlin began. "That's not how it happened. We'd been tracking signs for 3 days. Fresh footprints, 14 inches long, found in the mud near the creek on October 17th. Tree branches broken at a height no bear could reach. We knew something large was moving through that area, and Roger was certain it was what we'd come looking for." He described their camp setup, their daily routine of riding horseback along logging roads and game trails, following the creek drainage. On the morning of October 20th, they'd broken camp early, around 6:30 a.m., the air cold enough to see their breath. They rode for nearly 3 hours before reaching the section of Bluff Creek where the encounter happened. "We came around a bend in the creek," Gimlin said, his finger tracing an invisible path on the table. The horses started acting nervous, ears back, trying to turn around. That's when Roger saw her. She was crouched by the water, maybe 80 feet away, just drinking from the creek like it was the most natural thing in the world. I leaned forward. "What did you do?" Roger grabbed the camera out of his saddlebag, Gimlin said. He'd kept it ready, always loaded with fresh film. He jumped off his horse, stumbled a little because his legs were stiff from riding. The creature heard him, looked up, and started walking away. That's when Roger started filming. Gimlin stood and walked to his living room, returning with a folder full of photocopied film frames, enhanced prints from various analyses done over the decades. He spread them across the table, showing the famous sequence everyone knows. The creature walking left to right across the frame, its massive bulk covered in dark hair, arms swinging, muscles visible beneath the fur. Then, the moment that became iconic, when she looks back over her shoulder at the camera. "This part is real," Gimlin said firmly. "Every frame you've seen, that's exactly what happened. Female Bigfoot, about 7 feet 3 inches tall, roughly 600 pounds. You can see her breasts in some frames, proof she wasn't a man in a suit. The way her muscles move under the skin and fur, that's not something anyone could fake in 1967. We were two cowboys with a $200 camera. We didn't have Hollywood special effects. But then he pulled out a separate sheet, a hand-drawn diagram showing the full timeline. The famous footage was 59.5 seconds, but his diagram showed the complete 3 minutes and 42 seconds that Roger had actually filmed. Roger didn't stop filming when she disappeared into the trees, Gimlin said quietly. He kept the camera running. He followed her path, panning right, trying to keep her in frame. That's when he captured what we cut out. He looked at me hard, making sure I understood the weight of what he was about to reveal. The film stock Roger used was Kodachrome DAS, Gimlin continued. Comes in 50-foot rolls for 16mm cameras. At the speed Roger was cranking, maybe 16 to 18 frames per second. That's about 4 minutes of total recording time per roll. He used almost the entire roll that day. He kept filming for nearly 2 more minutes after the famous walking sequence. What did those 2 minutes show? Gimlin pushed the diagram toward me. After she walked into the trees, Roger panned the camera right, following her direction. The camera shows brush, forest, the far side of the creek, and then, about 40 to 50 yards behind where she'd been walking, the camera catches something else. My heart started pounding. What? Other figures, Gimlin said. In the tree line, standing partially hidden behind Douglas firs and hemlocks. At least 4 of them, maybe 5. All massive, all watching. They'd been there the whole time. The room seemed to tilt. You're saying there were multiple Bigfoots. Roger filmed them for about 8 seconds before they started moving back, deeper into the forest, Gimlin said. They weren't aggressive, weren't coming toward us, but they were big, David, bigger than the female. The one we got the clear footage of, she might have been young, maybe 7 feet tall. But these others, the ones watching from the trees, they were 8 feet, maybe more. Males, we figured, and they'd been guarding her. Why didn't you show this footage? Gimlin's laugh was bitter, because nobody would have believed it. Think about it. 2 guys go into the woods looking for Bigfoot and come back with footage of 6 of them. It would have looked fake immediately, too convenient, too perfect. We knew the single creature footage was remarkable enough that people would argue about it forever. But multiple creatures? That would have destroyed any credibility we had. He pulled out another sheet, this one showing splice marks he'd identified in various copies of the film over the years. Roger cut the film himself, Gimlin explained. Used a splicing kit, removed the sections before and after the main encounter. The before section showed us tracking, finding footprints, getting closer. The after section showed the others in the trees. He kept those cut segments separate, stored them carefully. Where are they now? Gimlin was quiet for a long moment. Safe. Roger gave them to me before he died. Made me promise to protect them. He said the world wasn't ready, might never be ready, but the truth needed to be preserved. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at his land. The female walked across that creek bed because she had backup, he said. She wasn't exposing herself despite us being there. She was exposing herself because of us. It was a warning, a show of presence. The others stayed hidden, but they made sure Roger filmed enough that we'd know we weren't in control of that situation. I sat there trying to process it. The implications were staggering. If there had been multiple creatures, it meant a family group, a social structure, a breeding population in 1967 in Northern California. After she walked away and Roger stopped filming, "We didn't stick around," Gimlin said. "We got back on our horses and we left, quickly." The horses didn't need convincing. They knew we were surrounded by something they wanted nothing to do with. "Did you see the others with your own eyes, or just through the camera?" "Both," Gimlin admitted. Once Roger pointed them out, I could see shapes in the trees. Not clear, not like the female in the open, but enough to know they were there, watching us watch her. He turned back to face me. "That's why Roger edited the film. That's why we've kept this secret for 50 years. We had proof of something incredible, but we knew showing all of it would make people think it was a hoax. So we showed just enough to make people wonder, to make them argue, to keep the mystery alive. Because the full truth was too big for anyone to accept." The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in late January 2023. I was in my home office reviewing footage from a documentary project when my cell phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice, strained and tired, introduced herself as Karen, Bob Gimlin's daughter. I'd met her briefly during one of my visits to the ranch years earlier. "Mr. Martinez," she said, and I heard her voice crack slightly. "Dad asked me to call you. He's been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors are saying he has maybe 3 months, possibly less. He wants to see you as soon as you can come." My coffee went cold in my hand. "When?" "Tomorrow if you can manage it," she said. "He's very insistent. He says there's something he needs to show you before it's too late." I made the drive to Yakima the next day, leaving Portland before dawn. The winter landscape looked harsh and unforgiving. Bare trees against gray sky, patches of old snow clinging to the north-facing slopes. I arrived at Gimlin's ranch just after 10 a.m. The place looked the same from the outside, but everything felt different. Heavier somehow, as if the house itself knew what was coming. Karen met me at the door. She was in her early 60s, with her father's blue-gray eyes and the same direct way of looking at people. "He's resting right now," she said quietly. "The medication makes him tired, but his mind is still sharp. He's been talking about you coming, saying he has to show you something important." She led me inside. The house smelled of coffee and something medicinal, antiseptic. Medical equipment had been set up in the living room, an oxygen concentrator humming softly in the corner, a hospital bed positioned near the window so Gimlin could look out at his land. He was sitting in a recliner beside the bed, wrapped in a thick blanket despite the heat from the wood stove. He'd lost weight, his face more angular, his hands appearing too large for his thinned wrists. But when he saw me, his eyes brightened. "David," he said, his voice raspier than I remembered. "Thank you for coming." I sat in the chair Karen brought over. We talked for a few minutes about nothing important. The weather, the drive, how his horses were doing. Then Karen excused herself, saying she needed to run errands in town. I understood she was giving us privacy. When the sound of her truck faded down the driveway, Gimlin shifted in his chair, wincing slightly. "I don't have much time," he said bluntly. "Doctors say 8 weeks, maybe 10. I've made my peace with it. I've had a good life, 92 years, more than most people get. But there's something I need to do before I go." He explained that he needed to go to town, to the bank specifically. There was something in a safe deposit box that he'd kept there for 51 years. Something he needed me to see and bear witness to. "Can you drive me?" he asked. "Karen worries too much, tries to keep me from doing things." But this is important. 2 days later, after he'd rested and gathered his strength, I drove Gimlin into Yakima in my truck. He sat in the passenger seat, oxygen tank secured between his feet, the plastic tubes in his nose connected to the concentrator. His breathing was labored, each breath seeming to cost him effort, but his jaw was set with determination. The bank was a small regional branch on a quiet street. The manager, a woman in her 40s who clearly knew Gimlin, looked concerned when she saw his condition. "Mr. Gimlin," she said, "are you sure you want to do this today?" "Been putting it off too long already," he replied. She led us to the vault, and Gimlin gave her the safe deposit box number. 237. He'd had this box since 1972, he told me as we waited. Opened it 3 months after Roger died, stored something important, and hadn't opened it since. The manager used her key and Gimlin's to open the box. She pulled out a long metal container and set it on the table in the small private room, then left us alone. Gimlin stared at the box for a long moment, his hand resting on the cold metal. "Inside this," he said, "are the film segments Roger cut out, the original 16mm film, stored in archival canisters that Roger had specially ordered. He gave them to me in the hospital, January 14, 1972, 6 days before he died. I was the only one there that night. His family had gone home to rest." Gimlin's hands shook as he opened the container. Inside were 2 small metal canisters, the kind used for film storage in the 1960s and 70s, along with a manila envelope. The canisters were labeled in faded ink, BC 102067 pre and BC 102067 post, Bluff Creek, October 20th, 1967, before and after. "Roger was so weak he could barely hold a pen," Gimlin said, his voice thick with emotion. "But he wrote something for me, instructions. He made me promise 3 things. First, never destroy the footage. Second, never release it for profit. Third, never show it to anyone unless I was absolutely certain they would protect it, not exploit it." He opened the manila envelope and pulled out a handwritten letter, the paper yellowed with age. Roger Patterson's handwriting, shaky but legible, filled a single page. I could see the salutation. "Bob, my friend." He knew he was dying, Gimlin said. He'd made peace with it. But he couldn't stand the thought of this footage falling into the wrong hands, being used to make money or being turned into a circus. He trusted me to decide when the time was right, if ever, to share what we really captured that day. "Why now?" I asked. "Why show me?" Gimlin looked at me with eyes that held decades of burden. "Because I'm dying too, and this secret dies with me unless I pass it on. You've spent years studying that film, approaching it with respect and genuine curiosity, not sensationalism. Roger and I, we were just cowboys. We didn't understand film the way you do, but I believe you'll know what to do with this, how to honor what we found without turning it into a spectacle." He carefully lifted out one of the canisters, the one marked Post. "This is what Roger filmed after the famous sequence," he said. "The part nobody's seen. The part that shows we weren't alone out there. The part that proves everything." We sat in that small room for nearly an hour while Gimlin told me more details, more context. He described Roger's state of mind in those final weeks, his obsession with making sure the footage was protected, his fear that someone would find it after his death and use it wrong. He talked about carrying this weight for 51 years, knowing the truth but unable to share it, watching skeptics call them liars while he held proof in a metal box. When we finally left the bank, Gimlin kept the canisters with him, placed carefully in a small bag Karen had given him for his medications. On the drive back to the ranch, he was quiet, exhausted from the outing. But before we reached his driveway, he spoke one more time. "Next visit," he said, "we'll watch it together. I have a projector. Old 16mm still works. You need to see what's on that film with your own eyes. Then you'll understand everything. Why we cut it, why we've protected it, and why what we filmed that day at Bluff Creek was more terrifying than anyone knows." I returned to Bob Gimlin's ranch on February 18, 2023. The day was cold and clear, temperature hovering around 28 degrees, the kind of sharp winter cold that makes everything feel brittle. Karen met me at the door, her face drawn with exhaustion. "He's been waiting for you," she said. "He refused his pain medication this morning because he wanted his mind clear." Gimlin was in his recliner, the oxygen concentrator working steadily beside him. He'd deteriorated visibly in the 3 weeks since I'd seen him. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his cheekbones stood out sharply. But his eyes were alert, focused. On the coffee table in front of him sat an old Bell and Howell 60mm projector, the kind used in schools and small movie theaters in the 1960s and 70s. Beside it were the 2 film canisters from the bank. Karen set up a white bedsheet on the wall opposite Gimlin's chair, thumbtacking the corners to create a makeshift screen. The room's curtains were already drawn, blocking out the winter sunlight. She looked at her father with concern. "Are you sure about this, Dad?" "I'm sure," he said. "David needs to see it. Someone needs to know before I'm gone." She squeezed his shoulder, then left us alone. I heard her footsteps in the kitchen, the sound of water running, giving us privacy for what was about to happen. I threaded the first canister onto the projector, the one marked pre. My hands were steadier than I expected, years of handling fragile archival film taking over. The film stock was Kodachrome Hatas, still in remarkable condition thanks to proper storage. I could see the sprocket holes were intact, the emulsion showing minimal degradation. "This part shows what happened before the famous sequence," Gimlin said as I started the projector. "Roger was filming as we approached the creek bend. You'll see the horses, see us tracking." The projector clattered to life, light spilling onto the makeshift screen. The footage was shaky, handheld, Roger Patterson walking and filming simultaneously. I could see tree branches, glimpses of sky, then a clearer shot of the creek itself, water flowing over rocks. The camera panned down, focusing on the creek bank, and there they were. Footprints. Massive, clear impressions in the mud, showing 5 distinct toes, a broad heel, an arch that suggested weight distribution unlike any bear. "We'd found these that morning," Gimlin narrated quietly. "Fresh, maybe a few hours old. You can see how deep they are, pressed into the mud. Whatever made them was heavy, walking upright." The footage continued. Roger filming the tracks from multiple angles, then the camera swinging up to show Gimlin on horseback, pointing toward something off camera. Then the image jerked, became unfocused, and the film ended. "That's when Roger jumped off his horse," Gimlin said, "when he saw her by the water. The famous footage starts right there." I carefully removed the first reel and threaded the second canister, the one marked post. My heart was hammering now. This was it. The footage nobody had seen for 56 years. After the creature walked into the trees, Roger kept filming, Gimlin said. He followed her direction with the camera. "This next part is about 90 seconds long. Watch carefully." I started the projector. The screen showed the now familiar sight of the female Bigfoot walking away. Her distinctive gait, the muscles moving under the dark fur. Then came the famous moment. The look back over her right shoulder, her face visible for just a few frames. But the footage didn't end there. Roger kept the camera running, panning right as the creature disappeared into the brush and timber. For a few seconds, there was just forest. Douglas firs, hemlocks, thick undergrowth. The camera moved slowly, following the path the creature had taken. Then it stopped, held steady on a section of tree line approximately 40 yards distant. "There," Gimlin said, his voice barely above a whisper. At first I didn't see it. The shadows were deep, the vegetation thick. But as my eyes adjusted to the image, I began to make out shapes. Large shapes, one behind a massive fir trunk, only partially visible. A shoulder covered in reddish-brown hair. An arm, thick and muscular, holding onto the tree as if bracing. Then another figure, farther back, darker fur, standing motionless between two trees. "Oh my God," I breathed. "Keep watching," Gimlin said. The camera held steady. Roger must have been using both. Hands now, no longer walking, just standing there filming what he was seeing. A third figure became visible, this one moving slightly, shifting position. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, maybe more, with shoulders that looked nearly 4 feet across. The proportions were wrong for a human, even a large human in a costume. The arms hung too low, the chest was too deep, the head sat differently on the shoulders. Then a fourth figure, off to the left of the frame. This one stepped partially out from behind a cedar tree, revealing itself more fully. It was massive, covered in dark brown hair that looked coarse and thick. The face was partially visible, a heavy brow ridge, deep-set eyes that seemed to catch the light for just a moment. It was looking directly at the camera, directly at Roger Patterson. "They're watching him film," I said, my voice shaking. "They were watching the whole time," Gimlin confirmed. While Roger filmed the female crossing the creek, these others were behind her, keeping distance but staying close enough, guarding her. When she walked away, they stayed put, making sure we saw them, making sure we understood the situation. The footage continued. One of the figures, the massive, dark one, took 2 deliberate steps forward. Not running, not charging, just walking slowly out from the trees. Each step was measured, controlled. A display of presence, of power. Then the figure stopped, standing fully visible now, and raised one arm. Not threateningly, but unmistakably. A gesture, a statement. Then the film went white, the end of the reel flapping as it spun. Roger stopped filming there, Gimlin said. His hands were shaking so bad he couldn't hold the camera steady anymore. We got back on our horses and we left. We didn't run, didn't panic, but we moved quickly. And the whole time we rode out of there, I kept looking back, expecting to see them following. But they didn't follow, they just let us go. I sat in silence, the projector still running, the white light harsh on the makeshift screen. How many were there total? 5 that we could see clearly on film, Gimlin said. Maybe 6. Roger thought he saw movement farther back in the trees, but the camera didn't catch it. The female in the creek bed, and at least 5 others watching from the forest. I rewound the second reel and played it again. This time, I knew what to look for, and the figures were unmistakable. Large, bipedal, covered in hair, watching with what appeared to be intelligence and purpose. This wasn't a random encounter with a lone creature. This was a family group, a clan, beings with social organization and protective instincts. "Now you understand why we cut this out," Gimlin said. One creature people could debate forever. Was it real? Was it a suit? Could 2 cowboys really have captured genuine footage? But 6 creatures? Nobody would have believed it. They would have called it an obvious hoax, said we staged it with multiple people in costumes. The footage would have been dismissed immediately and the truth would have died right there. He was right. The famous Patterson-Gimlin film worked because it showed just enough, one creature, clear footage, but not so much that it seemed impossible. The missing segments showed too much truth for the world to accept. So, you and Roger made the choice to edit it, I said, to show only what people might believe. Gimlin nodded slowly. Roger died knowing he had proof. Real, undeniable proof. But he also died knowing that proof would never be accepted. So he protected it the only way he knew how. By hiding it. 3 weeks after viewing the footage, I returned to Yakima for what would become Bob Gimlin's final interview. It was March 11th, 2023, and spring was trying to break through the last grip of winter. Patches of green showed through the brown grass, and early crocuses pushed up near Gimlin's porch steps. But inside the house, death was present in a way that couldn't be ignored. Gimlin had been moved to the hospital bed in the living room full-time now. Hospice nurses came twice daily. Karen rarely left his side. When I arrived, she hugged me at the door, tears in her eyes. "He's been asking for you," she said. "He wants to make sure you understand everything before he goes." I set up my recording equipment, a simple digital recorder and backup device, with Gimlin's permission. "This isn't for publication," I told him. "This is for the record, for history. So your full account exists somewhere." "Good," he said, his voice thin but steady. "Roger never got to tell his complete story. I won't make that mistake. Over the next 4 hours, with breaks when Gimlin needed rest or medication, he told me everything." He described the decision-making process after they returned from Bluff Creek in 1967, how they'd watched the raw footage together in Roger's garage, seeing what they'd captured and realizing immediately that it was too much. Roger said nobody would believe 6 of them, Gimlin recalled. He said we had to be smart about this, strategic. If we wanted people to take it seriously, we could only show the part that was undeniable but not impossible. So he got out his splicing kit and made the cuts himself. Removed the lead-up footage with the tracks, removed the aftermath with the others in the trees. Kept those segments in separate canisters. I asked him about the years that followed, the decades of interviews and documentaries where he'd defended the film's authenticity while knowing he was only defending part of the truth. "It was the hardest thing I've ever done," he admitted. "Standing there while people called us liars, called Roger a hoaxer, knowing I had proof locked away that would vindicate us completely. But I'd made a promise to Roger, and I kept it." He told me about 2 other encounters he'd had over the years, sightings he'd never reported to anyone. Once in 1973, while hunting elk in the Cascade Mountains, he'd seen a large figure moving through heavy timber, about 200 yards away. He'd watched it for perhaps 30 seconds before it disappeared into the forest, moving with the same fluid gait as the creature from Bluff Creek. Then, in 1989, while camping alone in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, he'd woken in the middle of the night to something large moving around his campsite. He'd lain perfectly still in his sleeping bag, listening to footsteps that were too heavy to be bear or elk, watching a shadow pass between his tent and the moonlight. In the morning, he'd found tracks, 16 inches long, pressed deep into the soft ground near where he'd parked his truck. "I never reported either encounter," he said. "What would be the point? I'd already given the world everything they were willing to accept. More stories from me would just make people think I was seeing Bigfoots everywhere, that I was obsessed or crazy." Karen brought him water, helped him drink through a straw. He was fading, the effort of talking clearly exhausting him. But he wasn't finished. "The biggest thing people need to understand," he said, his eyes finding mine with startling intensity, is that what we filmed in 1967 wasn't a lone creature wandering the forest. It was a family, a group with structure and purpose. The female walked out into the open because she had backup, because the others were there to protect her if things went wrong. It was a calculated risk they took, and it paid off because Roger and I weren't a threat. We were just two men with a camera, and they let us leave with our lives and our footage. He paused, breathing heavily. That's what the missing footage proves. It proves intelligence, organization, social bonds strong enough that they'd risk exposure to protect one of their own. If people saw that, really understood it, they'd have to acknowledge these aren't just undiscovered animals. They're people. Different from us, but people nonetheless. I asked him the question that had been weighing on me since I'd watched the hidden footage. What do you want me to do with this? The film canisters, Roger's letter, your testimony. What happens to all of it? Gimlin was quiet for a long moment. I'm leaving the canisters to you in my will, he said finally. Karen knows she agrees. What you do with them is your choice. You can release them, keep them hidden, destroy them if you think that's right. Roger trusted me to protect them. And now I'm trusting you to decide what the world needs to know. But if I may make a suggestion, he continued, don't release the footage itself. Not yet, maybe not ever. Describe what's on it, like you're doing now with this recording. Let people know it exists, that Roger and I captured something extraordinary. But the footage itself, the actual film, that's too valuable and too vulnerable. Release it, and it'll be analyzed to death. Picked apart, probably stolen or lost. Keep it safe, keep it protected, and let the mystery remain. Over the next 2 weeks, Gimlin's condition deteriorated rapidly. I visited 3 more times, brief visits where he was mostly sleeping, occasionally waking to squeeze my hand, or nod acknowledgement that I was there. Karen called me on March 29th, early in the morning. Dad passed about an hour ago, she said, her voice steady despite the tears I could hear. He was peaceful. He went knowing he'd told the truth, finally. The funeral was small, held at a church in Yakima on a rainy April morning. Maybe 40 people attended, mostly family, a few old friends from his rodeo days, some local ranchers who'd known him for decades. I sat in the back, feeling like an outsider to this community's grief, but Karen had insisted I come. You were important to him at the end, she told me. After the service, Karen gave me a box. Inside were the film canisters, Roger Patterson's letter, Gimlin's personal notebooks from 1967, and the Cine Kodak K100 camera itself. This is yours now, she said. Dad wanted you to have all of it. Use it wisely. I drove back to Portland with that box on my passenger seat, feeling the weight of what I'd inherited. Not just film and paper, but responsibility. The burden of witness that had crushed Roger Patterson and aged Bob Gimlin beyond his years now rested with me. In the months since, I've had the footage professionally archived, stored in climate-controlled conditions that will preserve it for decades to come. I've documented everything, created redundant copies of the documentation, made sure the story survives even if something happens to the physical film. But I've followed Gimlin's advice. I haven't released the footage publicly. I've described what it contains, shared the story of how it came to exist and why it was hidden. But the images themselves remain protected. Some people will say I'm perpetuating a cover-up, that I'm no better than Patterson and Gimlin, hiding evidence that could prove Bigfoot exists. Others will say I'm a fool, that the footage probably shows nothing, that the whole story is elaborate fiction. Let them think what they want. I know what I saw on that makeshift screen in Bob Gimlin's living room. I saw evidence of beings we share this world with, beings that have learned to hide from us so well that we've convinced ourselves they're myths. The famous Patterson-Gimlin footage shows one creature walking across a creek bed. The hidden footage shows at least 5 more watching from the trees, protecting their own, displaying intelligence and social organization that demands we see them as more than animals. Roger Patterson died in 1972 keeping this secret. Bob Gimlin carried it for 51 more years. Now I carry it, and someday I'll have to decide who carries it after me. Because some truths are too important to die, even if they're too dangerous to fully reveal. I still make the drive to Bluff Creek sometimes, standing near the spot where Roger Patterson aimed his camera on October 20th, 1967. The forest looks different now, logging roads carved deeper into the wilderness, more hikers passing through. But in the early morning, when the mist hangs low over the creek and the Douglas firs cast long shadows, I can imagine what Patterson and Gimlin saw. I can picture the female walking across the water, confident and powerful, knowing her family watched from the trees behind her. And I wonder if they're still out there, the descendants of those creatures from 1967, still watching, still hiding, still protecting their own in the deep places where humans rarely go. The footage Bob Gimlin entrusted to me suggests they are. It proves they were there once, organized and aware and intelligent. Some truths are too big for the world to accept, but they remain true whether we believe them or not.